Hi guys, I'm Danny, and I started a Sunday gym because I've noticed lately that people tend to go to colleges and universities without actually knowing why they're there. And afterwards, starting jobs that are unfulfilling. So I'm interviewing different professionals to see what they have to say and share their knowledge and experience with you. I hope you enjoy it. Right on, Tom. Thanks for being with me, man. How are you doing today?
Pretty good.
Glad to hear. The program will be focused on three main questions. What do you do for a living? How did you get there? And how did you knew that this was the way to go? So that's what you do for a living, please.
Sure. So a little bit about my background. Currently been at Americans for Prosperity for a little over 6 years now. A
Speak
little
a
bit.
little bit louder for me, please.
Sure. Can you hear me a little better now?
I think so, yeah.
Um, so a little bit about my background. I've been with Americans for Prosperity for a little over 6 years now. I've worked pretty much with policy issues. I work with potential people looking to get involved in the public policy process, run for office. So I've been in that space beforehand. I used to work for Leadership Institute, which is where I train people how to run for office, fundraise, and beforehand worked for a lot of other public policy organizations, consulting firms, political campaigns. A little bit about my background, originally from California, born and raised in Ventura County. And how I kind of fell into this kind of path was a little bit by accident, also a little bit about
Yeah,
risk
I was
taking.
about to ask you, like walking the street one day and you were like, let me be a political coach for 6 years, or something else happened?
Well, what happened was I mean, it goes back to high school. There was like some subjects I liked, I did really well at, some subjects not as well at, and I wasn't even sure about the whole college path. I know something my parents really persuaded me. I had kind of some other things in mind. I'll say like when I graduated high school, 17, kind of lost, figuring out where to go. Definitely considered the military route, and kind of as a compromise, I ended up going to a community college, specifically Moore Park College, is where I took some risks. I wasn't even sure what kind of major I wanted, which is why I'm glad I took that route, and it might have saved me a lot of money and heartache and other issues. So what I did was played around with some majors, took some risks in some classes. Eventually, I knew I kind of had an interest in the public policy space, but it was also jumping between being a business major. I liked video games, but I realized I wasn't a route dealing with programming, not my skill set by any means. But once I kind of figured out what I wanted, and very much like kind of my background, like if I don't see the why, or if I'm not really motivated, kind of a little bit of the ADD stuff, I may not want to do that. So I
And
figured
that's
out
the
what I
best thing. You know, if you
so
don't see it in front of you, just don't do it.
yeah, exactly. And so I found something I can almost kind of hyper focus on that I was passionate about. More importantly, I could pay bills with. There was a career route, and I think that kind of gets into a little bit of the theme where there's kind of this pressure, kind of this old model where you have to go to a 4 year degree or you don't have a future. And sometimes people kind of run into a major they're not passionate about, or just not really something they can make money off of. So I did community college. I got an associate's from there. I figured that as a benchmark. So if college ended up not working out, I still had something to show for it. Transferred to CLU, Cal Lutheran University. It's a private university in Thousand Oaks. And then once I kind of knew what I wanted, the upper division, and eventually I decided grad school a little later, because I knew what I wanted to do. I knew how I wanted to use the degree. And something that was really cool about the school I went to, the professors very much encourage and even incentivized students to get involved instead of just spending your time in a classroom, was get involved in political campaigns, issue campaigns. They didn't care one leaning one way or the other. They just wanted to show involvement and show that you did that. And I think that's really what made me so effective, I think, in my career. And that really kind of kickstarted my ability to network, to meet people, and get that experience. And now when I'm, kind of doing all the stuff I'm doing now, I could talk about my degree, and I do to a little bit, but that's not really what I kind of show my value. It's really the experience I gained. So like while I was going through undergrad, I had a series of campaigns I started to intern with, eventually got paid for some of them. And then I took a few months off after my undergrad years, figuring out what I wanted to do. Because I was in this crossroads. I'm like, do I want to revisit the military route? Do I want to go to law school? There's things I was really passionate about for law school, but it's kind of running a cost benefit analysis. I'm like, where will I end up in 5 years with this much debt? Do I want to be stuck in California? So I moved over to a public policy route. That's where I got my master's in public policy and administration, and I was working for a federal agency while I was in school. So I was paying bills, using my degree, and then while I was in grad school, I actually got my first full-time job at a consulting firm. So by the time I was done with all my college experience, I already was working professionally in this field. So I think it's kind of how I fell into it. And I'd say risk taking, going to a community college, kind of doing some experiments, figuring out where I can create value, kind of fit in this world. And it was kind of cool with the consulting firm is I kind of got my first taste of paid work travel. And I knew afterwards, I mean, it was a little tough in grad school because I actually had to, I don't even know if it was Zoom back in like 2012. It was whatever version of this. I actually had to Zoom into a few classes because I'd be on work travel, and the professors are very especially in grad school. They're like, "Hey, you're using your degree actively, and you're in this class. Why don't you just talk about what project you're working on?" And then once I got a taste for that, I just kind of took off and lived a very long nomadic life where I bounced around the country. That eventually led me to Virginia.
Pretty fascinating story. I loved how you mentioned the personal cost benefit analysis that you made. And I think every person above the age of 18 has the moral obligation to do that for themselves because it saves a lot of trouble, saves a lot of money. Well, maybe not that much money, but now I know in the US things are like that. Like, for example, here in Europe, things are not like that. Most colleges, like most of them, colleges, universities are like ridiculously cheap. I was going to start a PhD, and it was gonna cost me about 500 euro per year, which is I think 500 and something US dollars, which is pretty affordable. Like everybody can afford that. So the fact that you were wise enough to do that says enough. So that's pretty solid. You
Yeah, I think it also just comes from like how I was raised. Like, grew up in a nice area, still middle class, but like lower middle class. So money was a little tighter. So that was always been my
Yeah.
mindset. So like even in college, like some of the cars I had, you could definitely tell it was a mechanic, but they were running. I had a lot of projects. People were like, "Well, why are you doing that?" I'm like, "Well, if I don't, like, I don't get to work with all the jobs I have. I don't get to school, like there, or I'd have to find other ways to get around." And I think kind of that at least mindset, understanding like there isn't just free money out there, or there isn't just some trust fund. I'm having to make some of these, and I still, I'm doing a lot better now. Things are still expensive, especially with everything going on in the world. But I think that's something that younger people, I don't think quite have that mindset. And it's, I don't want to say it's fine, but I think at least think about the
It's
risk
definitely not
analysis.
fine. I mean, at some point you have to ask yourself, is it worth it?
Oh,
And
yeah,
and you have to
that
ask yourself not only that about money, about relationships, about career choices, about uni choices, about everything. Is it worth it?
yeah,
I
that was
my
like,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was going to say that was kind of why I moved away from or not going to law school. It was like, do I want to eat all those costs? Do I want to be trapped in a state? What will I do with that degree? And I was kind of doing some basic research. And at that time, it was like housing crisis. Law firms were melting down. There were
Well, which year was that?
this was like, I want to say I graduated in 2012.
Okay.
Uh, so California, I mean, it's just that the after all the housing crisis, but there's stories one after another of law
Yeah,
firms
we had
melting
the same
down.
thing in Europe. 2012 was actually when I graduated as well. I
Oh,
graduated in 2013, but I was already working in 2012.
okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of that. I'm like, oh man, I don't really want to go through all those struggles of going through law school, maybe pass, maybe don't, and then have a job. And I think public policy allowed me a lot more, not just opportunities, but what I long term want to do is change how things work, advocate for the things I care about. I think it made me much more valuable because I can jump state to state and leverage a lot of my experience, even change not just public policy, but even how the legal system works.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with you because I kind of work the same way. My career started in the government sector, in the public sector. I was a financial analyst in the railway infrastructure company, and it's part of the EU infrastructure, mostly train railway infrastructure. So it's a pretty good start. I hated it. I hated every minute of it. and I hated almost everybody in there. I'm giving that example every now and then. You've seen this Johnny Depp movie where he's a pirate?
Oh yeah, Pirates of the Caribbean.
That one. So he's walking into a ship, and they're like, the crew is part of the ship, right? Part of the walls. That's basically almost every government institution. Like they don't have shoes, they have roots, and they up in the floor. But I really didn't like it, but it was very useful for two main things. First of all, and let's be reasonable, let's be honest here. College and university, that's not real life. All right, it just is. It's a very well-controlled simulation, and it's not really a very serious one. Now, government sector isn't real life either, but it kind of gives you that overview. It's huge, it's slow, it sometimes it's out of touch. And I was able to see that, but it was a good training ground. In all fairness, because I was an absolute jackass when I got out of university. Right? I was pompous, I was arrogant, I was stupid. I mean, it is what it is. So with that kind of behavior, probably like 99% sure, probably nobody was gonna tolerate me in the private sector for more than about an hour. So yeah, I didn't like it, but they didn't like me either. And about the third question, how did you know that this was the way to go? You did cover it, but however, you're a pretty awesome speaker. You have the ability to explain a lot in short sentences. That's a pretty useful skill. You are an intelligent man, well-traveled. You could have chosen any number of professions. You didn't. Well, and basically, my question is why? And you did even cover the reason. People are going to colleges, to universities, simply because of that stigma to get a diploma to secure my life, which is I'm sure you've seen it. It doesn't work like that. You're not securing anything. Most of the time, the only thing that is certain is that you're gonna lose between 4 and 6 years. There's this meme I saw on LinkedIn. A guy's applying for a job, and the interviewer says, just forget everything you've learned in college. All right, you're not gonna need it. And the guy that's applying for a job says, well, I didn't go to college. He said, well, then you're not qualified. So yeah, it's a problem. And I think it's not being addressed a lot. And that's why I'm collecting all of those stories and interviews. And that's why I wanted to know, how did you knew with all the options that you had? Was it a gut feeling? Were you influenced by a friend, a mentor, a parent? What happened?
I think it's a combination of a few things. Like did some research. I think it helped a little. Even though when I was younger, getting out of high school in 2006, kind of knew I had to, go to college. There was a strong pressure there. I think there's been, at least in the US in some places, I mean, we're having this conversation now, so I know this is happening all over the place, but there's a conversation, is a college degree worth it? And I remember just thinking about how expensive school books were, and I found ways around that. Like there was tricks where a lot of the books would actually be in the library and you can actually copy the chapters you need. And I think the school I went to, I think gave you X amount of like a credit that you can use up to, and then beyond that, you just paid out of pocket. And
Yeah.
I'm like, even if I had to pay a few dollars out of pocket, beats a heck out of a $200 book. And I'm told that makes me start that I'm old now, because those books are not $200 or $100 anymore. They might be $300-$500 per subject, and the professor might not even use it. So I think it was a little bit of research. I think there's definitely pressures, good and bad, from all angles. I think every kind of level of schooling I went through, it was like a stop, check, ask, some forward thinking, some analysis. But I think, especially now, just how expensive things are, at least in the US, and there's a question of how valuable it is. I mean, there's some degrees that can be valuable, but there's some people that I'm like, hey, are you in that top 10 or 20% based off the industry and the degree? And if you're not, maybe you should rethink this. And maybe there's also, I know in Virginia, for example, there's been a push to actually get rid of the college requirement for certain careers, certain government jobs, and that actually just passed right now, where instead of a college degree, maybe you could substitute it with some sort of other training, some sort of other experience based off of the, whatever the position is. And I think we might start to see more of that, but I think it's definitely going to have to be conversations like this. It's going to have to be a culture change. But for me, that influenced a lot of it. It was like, where am I going to go? What type of influence? And I was able to play around, but I think I got experience early on, and I took some risks. And I'm not going to say what I did was perfect. There's a lot
It
of learning
never is.
opportunities. Yeah. And there's also the X factor. There's things that you may not be able to predict. I mean, imagine just getting out of college in 2019 thinking like, the next few years are going to be great. And then I remember for a lot of the work I'm doing, I remember early 2020, I had these awesome plans and the whole world changed, and all this stuff that I had to sit down with my coworkers, we had to rewrite it.
The company that I currently employed at, back then the CEO had this video. I'm not gonna mention names or anything, I don't want to, but so the CEO is meeting his future self, right? It was at the end of December 2019. And the future self was like, next year gonna be amazing, you're gonna see it gonna be perfect, and well, we all know what happened.
Yeah.
And I was like, maybe we should like avoid that for now. Like maybe for the next 10 years, maybe we shouldn't do any future self videos. Just because I'm an Orthodox Christian, so of course I am forgiving as it is written, but man, I still remember how they acted with that toilet paper thing. That was ridiculous.
Yeah, there's a lot that could be said. I mean, for the US, I mean, every state was different. I mean, because we're like 50 countries in one.
Oh yeah,
Some are
here as well, yeah.
some are open, some are hybrid, some they're arresting people on the beach. And even within those states, I mean, each county could be governed wildly different.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's no way to predict that. And I feel like during those times, I was just like, all right, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. But I think there was a lot of problems in the pandemic, but I think there was a lot of things were opening up. I mean, we're looking at education in general, like K through 12. There's a lot of things we've been needing to change for decades to prepare young people for a new workforce. Problems in the
No, I
US
completely agree with you. I'm giving this example every now and then here. Like both my father and my grandfather, they passed. But I remember my father telling me, his father, when my father was 16, 17 something, his father told him, because my father has a technical background, he was a mechanic, and his father told him, make sure you know how to fix a TV, because everybody has a TV in their home. You have a guaranteed work for the rest of your life. Tom, when was the last time you actually sent your TV to a repair shop? Because I personally have never done this. If it works, fine, and if it doesn't, I'm getting a new one. I don't even know where to send it for repair. And the same is for phones. I'm fixing my own computer and my own laptop, and if it's way too complicated, I don't know where to, send it, but not a TV. Thing is that for a very long time, about 100 and something years now, the parents are preparing the children for a world that doesn't exist. I'm sure you are familiar with those very, very iconic red phone booths in Britain, right? In London. Do you know the story behind them?
No.
So when they were installed at late 1800s, after Alexander Bell installed the line, the postal syndicate destroyed them all in one evening because they were afraid that they'd be out of a job. That was about 140 or about 150 years ago. Tom, I've never been in Britain, but I'm pretty sure that right now, if I go over there, I can get a job as a mailman. So the world is ridiculously dynamic, and we really need to see how to. Yeah, of course, there are professions right now that weren't available 20 years ago, and probably they won't be available in 20 years as well. But I firmly believe that we need to do something about this educational system. Like when I was in college, I graduated in international business administration. I studied things that were from the 17th century. Like, but what am I gonna do with that? It, how am I gonna use it?
Yeah, I
I
mean
was in
that.
high school and I'm an accountant, a financial analyst by trade, but I was never really good at math. And I asked the teacher, like, what do I why would I need this for? I have a calculator. And she's like, well, are you gonna have a calculator in your pocket every day? I'm like, yeah, yeah, I do.
That I heard the same thing, and that aged so poorly. It was like, well, you're not gonna have a calculator everywhere you go, and
Yeah,
it
that
was
age like a box of milk.
it's
The
same with
cheap
like
one.
when I had to learn how to use maps, which are horrible. And they're like, "Oh, if you don't have that paper map, how are you going to get around?" I'm like, "I don't know. I think this whole, online printing off the map Bing thing might get more advanced." People are like, "I don't know." And then now I have people tell me who's around the corner, and I may see other people on the GPS map, whatever app I'm using. But yeah, I mean, in the US, when we're talking about like K through 12, we're preparing kids for a society that doesn't exist, for a job market that maybe made sense in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's just not there. And then you're putting kids in college who are trying to unlearn what they did in K through 12, which I'm not dismissing all through K through 12. There's a lot of good things in there, but I just remember it just not be preparing me for a new society. And then college professors are in a weird position where and I'm sure that a lot of them are teaching relevant things, but they're having to fix all the K through 12 problems and then prepare kids for a new society. And some schools are doing a really good job of that. And some professors do an awesome job of that. And then others are just like, oh, you're teaching me outdated stuff. And it even goes down to a lot of the research papers I would do.
Yeah.
And it was like, there's a format you followed it's been a long time, and it gives you an idea. I don't use that format anymore because the second I went into, either it was government, private, consulting, some hybrid, we've never used any of the college format. Actually, they were very clear when new hires would come up. It's like, hey, this isn't a college class. We have a new format, and here's what you do. And if you don't do it, well, it's not like you're gonna get doctor grade, you're gonna get fired. So, I mean, these are just things we have to think about. And I think as we kind of hold colleges more accountable, people start rethinking it. Maybe students maybe look at other alternative skills, maybe even community college. It may force universities to be like, hey, like there's a lot of smart people. They have they have a lot of money. Some of them, could just live off their endowment or any other reserves they have. They may be like, hey, in order to survive the next maybe 10, 20, 50 years, we might have to rethink what we're doing. And I think that's the last few years has been a wake-up call for everyone around the world. And I think we all try. I mean, we're on Zoom now, so I'm not dismissing Zoom, but I
Yeah,
know,
in all fairness, I'm very thankful for COVID. I
yeah,
know it caused tremendous damage, but it had some benefits. Like for example, when you're always in a hurry, and we like me, like my circle, we were always in a hurry before COVID. Like I think that I don't even remember the last time I actually sat down on a table to have a dinner. Like I'm always running somewhere. I'm eating while I'm walking, and that's a bad thing. But it was like that. And when the world hit that break, you kind of had that time to sit down and reflect on what you were doing. And yeah, actually, as the question you asked yourself, was it worth it?
uh, yeah. I mean, that there's just a lot of things I had to rethink. I remember I would usually be pretty physically active. I remember during the pandemic, spent a lot more time outdoors, running, doing other things. I know a lot of people with kids were like, "Hey, what's going on here? Like, what are you teaching?" And then it's like, "Oh, like how's this preparing them for a new generation?" Uh, so I think I mean, I'm not advocating saying that COVID overall was good, but there was some silver linings, some wake up calls.
Yeah.
There was a lot of new innovations, and I think obviously moving forward, we're going to use some of those innovations and also think about better approaches to any future, situations that are very similar. But I mean, this hopefully students starting to wake up and being like, hey, is this the right thing? Or maybe they're kind of in the right path, maybe in the lower division class, getting their prereqs done. And maybe they need to start thinking a lot faster, like, how do I make money off this degree? And if they are not thinking about that, now if they have a full ride, you know, that's fine. But I think a lot of, at least my advice, it's like, hey, maybe you have a partial scholarship, but like is it worth going into that far of debt? And it's kind of wild to think about, at least in the US, because if I was 18 to start a small business with no credit history, maybe, high school degree and go to bank, I'm like, hey, can you give me over the next 4 years 20, 30, $50,000? And I might pay you back off the hope I get a job. I mean, banks would probably be like, I don't know. Or maybe it's like,
Yeah.
can you put up something for collateral? Or can you have some sort of metric to show that you will actually get that degree? And so, like, we know banks would not do that, the private sector, but here in the US, you'd have the government just blanketly give out these loans without any accountability. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole of a political discussion, but with those things, I think there's a lot of kids that don't fully grasp, how far in debt you go. And they're, for in terms of loans, they're not the worst loans to have, but you can't default on them. You can't get out of them, and you owe the federal government, and it's really hard to outrun the federal government wherever you go, domestically or internationally. And so there are consequences to being in debt to the one of the most powerful countries in the world.
I
And people
couldn't
should,
agree more. Like, for example, I have a debt. My debt is pretty big, but I took it because I had to buy property, and I'm renting now, so I'm basically paying it off. And I had that plan, and debt on its own is not a bad thing as long as you can cover it.
uh,
But of
yeah.
all the people that I've known over the years and talked to, I think there is only one that I know of that has student loan. I've never seen this before in my life, and I found about it when I started my channel.
It's it's definitely a huge problem. And I remember thinking, when I was done with all my schooling, I'm like, oh man, like how are we going to recover from this? How are people going to get by, with 20, 30, 40,000? Now I'm hearing like college is way more expensive, especially some of the Ivy League schools. Like if you don't get a full ride or any sort of scholarship, I think it's Columbia is something like 90,000 a year. And I'm like, oh, okay, so you're gonna have to be rich, because I don't know how you'd even.
90,000,
Yeah.
like 90 with 3 zeros behind it.
Let me double check that, because last I looked, I'm gonna just look at real
A
quick just to
year.
make sure. Columbia. Uh,
Well, for 4 years, you can buy pretty amazing accommodations for that kind of money.
yeah, I mean, you could buy a house and then rent it out and
No,
live
I
off
was
that.
mostly thinking about purchasing garages and parking spaces because those are like you don't have to do anything about it on them, and
So
it's a
yeah,
guaranteed income.
so I just did a quick Google search, and it's 86,000 before any sort of student aid or anything else being offered.
And that is painful.
And so you either better get a full ride, some sort of massive scholarship, be a 4.0 student, or be, from a family with a lot of money.
Yeah,
Because like, and now that's not the price for every university. I think the school I went to, and this was like years ago, so I have no idea what the prices are now. But when I
double them.
well, community college was very cheap.
Yeah,
No issues there. When I went over to a private school, it cost a little bit more than the state school I got accepted to. So I was willing to pay a little bit. I think it was like 20-ish, 30,000 a year, and I got like a partial scholarship. And I think the advantage was I got a partial scholarship. And two, at the time, California, there's a lot of state universities that are having issues with students getting the right classes. So kids were stuck you know, in college longer than they should have been. And CLU had a guarantee where, hey, if you're on track, if you're doing everything right, we will get you out on the scheduled time. And if something were, especially if you started as a freshman there, they would actually cover the cost. So if there's a fifth year because of some issue, it'd be free. And also the professors were heavily incentivized to make sure that it happens, encourage, taking summer classes, extra units. So that was my reason to go to a private school over state, even though it was a little bit more expensive.
and that's a pretty good reason. I mean, you got something out of it. And because of time, I got a fourth question. I'm sure you can talk about this all day, but to put it short, mostly my audience is made of people that are currently working somewhere, studying something, and they're asking that question, is this for me? Am I made for this? At some point, we're all asking ourselves those questions. And if you can give them one advice, what will it be?
I think, especially if you're already maybe have a degree already working, I would say you don't really stop learning. Doesn't mean you have to go back to a 4-year university. I mean, just to do what I do in the public policy space, what I learned how to do 10, 15 years ago, a lot of it still applies. But I mean, the world has changed so much. And especially when it comes to AI technology, when it comes to data-driven campaigns, I mean, every industry is going to change. So I think people should be, especially if you're younger, let's say you're just out of college or in college, take risks, because if you don't take risks, you might be stuck that was always a fear. Like I'd be stuck somewhere I didn't want to be. Be willing to travel, especially if certain industries are not where you live. Be willing to learn, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And if that wasn't clear before 2020, it should be clear now, because things are changing. Embrace the change. It is scary. There are dangers, there are risks, but be willing to keep learning. In some cases, some people may go back to school, redo industry, go to a different industry. I've just helped a few friends do that. So I would say, like, just because you're out of school, you don't stop learning. And just make sure anything you do, just factor in some risk benefit analysis. I mean, personally, I kind of like the idea of, I know there's a bigger push post college, like, what work-life balance looks like. And, I'm kind of in this fun hybrid where I do work and travel a lot, but when I'm not traveling, I can work remotely. Those are just things to think about. But I think, at least for the theme of this conversation, take risks, be willing to learn. Any degree or schooling or education or anything you're investing in, make sure you do at least some sort of basic ROI. Search engines are easy to use. They're smarter people than you or I that, and a lot of times I'm always seeking advice from other people, especially not just in my industry, but for some of the side gigs I'm doing. I'm like, how can I tinker with this? How can I make it better? What worked? Where did I fail? And could I share this knowledge with someone else?
And that's a perfect advice, especially to take the risk, because when you're young, you're 17, 18, 19. I mean, what do you got to lose? You got a couple of shirts and a pair of socks to your name. So, not like, even if you lose those, you can, recover from it. And that's exactly the time to make mistakes. So that's absolutely a perfect advice. And with that said, Tom, thanks for being with me, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right on. Guys, I hope this one was useful. Please follow the channel on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Gap, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Ring the bell and all the good stuff. Have a nice week ahead, and I'll see you next Sunday.